I don't really think aging is really a disease. I think it's just but it is a root cause of a lot of diseases. Obviously, we know it's a very strong risk factor for a disease. The problem about calling it a disease is if it's a disease, then everyone is ill, because everybody's aging.
Aging is something every human experiences, yet we still understand very little about it. Historically, aging was seen as something inevitable, a slow, unavoidable decline that medicine could do very little to influence. But modern science is beginning to ask a radically different question. What if aging itself is biology we can influence? In this episode, we explore that question with David Weinkove, a professor and researcher in longevity science, microbiome, and metabolism, and is also the chair of the British Society for Research on Aging. This is not a conversation about immortality. It's about understanding why we decline, why chronic diseases may share common roots, and whether the future of medicine may begin targeting aging itself. David, welcome to Brighter 100.
Thanks, Anil. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, historically speaking, aging was almost viewed as fate, an inevitable decline, rather than something biology could actually explain. Now, you spent years studying aging biology. When one talks about aging, what are they actually referring to?
That's a good question. So, in my way of thinking about aging, is that aging is a decline in function through time, and the changes that happen with time, and so it's very clear whether you look at whatever kind of animal you look at, you see that decline happening, and you see, and that's kind of what aging is. But
Right.
aging, I mean, aging for everyone in the world has a concept of the word aging, but
Right.
biologically it is quite tricky to pin it down to a single thing. And I think we can talk about that.
Yeah,
Let's talk
I
about
think
that.
there's a lot of confusion around the word aging because everybody seems to be defining it in their own way. At what at what point did scientists begin seriously asking whether aging itself may be modifiable?
Well, I think there's been lots of discussion and thought about aging. I think in the for like over 100 years, people are discussing aging in especially in the UK and elsewhere, because they've seen that different animals have different
Right.
lifespans, and that's a kind of a comparative point of view. But I think in terms of whether it can be modified, the the kind of evolutionary explanation was that animals adapt to their natural history, to their lifestyle, if you like. So if an animal is likely to be eaten very easily by a predator, you know, there's no point living a long time because they're going to die anyway. So in that circumstance, it's better to have lots of children very quickly before you die, and then you can survive, because each animal, every animal that's alive today has millions and millions of successful ancestors that made it. So you have to make it in evolution, and then once you've had your offspring, then there's no real selective pressure to stay alive. Or once you're
Right.
not no longer producing any more offspring, there's no pressure to stay alive. So there was a kind of evolutionary sense that aging is different, and that we know that some animals live a lot longer and have different strategies. So an albatross only has one chick every 2 years, but they live
Right.
for a long time, so they can have lots of children, whereas other birds might have lots and lots of chicks every year. But it was thought that that was something that was a kind of secondary effect of on changes of multiple different genes. But when I think people change is when they found these single gene mutants in the worm C. elegans, and mutation of just one gene made a massive effect on lifespan and made a worm that could live twice as long. Then
Right.
people started to think, well, okay, maybe it can be modified just by simple changes of just one or two genes, and that made people think more about what is the genetic basis of aging.
Right. So would you say that as per evolution, the only reason you're here is to create progeny, or is it something more?
Well, from a natural selection point of view, it's not a question of what we're here for. The only reason we are here is because you're only here because your parents
Right.
made it long enough to have children and had you, right? And the
Right.
same goes for them and their parents and so on, right? So you can
Yeah.
go back all the way back to the first cell. So that's the reason we're here. And so there's very strong selection for that because if you don't make it, your genes don't get passed on. So
Okay.
so that's just evolution. It's not a question of necessarily a question of purpose. It's just a question of facts.
You were just mentioning that aging essentially is biologically it's a decline. So is aging best understood as wear and tear, accumulated damage of programmed biology, or is the reality far more interconnected than that?
I think it's very, I think biological systems are very interconnected. And when you think about aging, you can't necessarily think about wear and tear. I mean, yes, there is a wear and tear element to it, but you can't necessarily think about wear and tear of one particular thing. There's multiple systems of what we call homeostasis that
Right.
maintain us, that keep us going, right? There's so many different things that keep us, you could say even simple things like when you're hungry, you eat food. That's a version of homeostasis. When you're hot, you find a cool place. Those are ways of doing homeostasis, but those homeostasis work on different levels. So it works on a molecular level, it works on a cellular level, it works on an organ level. All these different organs and cells and everything are all trying to maintain themselves. And we have very strong mechanisms to do that. Now, what happens with aging is that some of those mechanisms stop working.
Hmm.
Okay. And but it's different for every person. It's all slightly different. Different mechanisms start working in different ways. And aging is a decline, and it is a form of wear and tear. But it all depends on which mechanisms decline first. And because we have this homeostasis, if one mechanism doesn't work, we have another mechanism to do it. Like we have two
Right.
kidneys, so if one kidney stops working, the other one can you're fine because the other one can do the job. So there's
Yeah.
ways we can get around it, and then different people age in different ways, or because
Yeah.
we've all got our own ways, all have our own susceptibilities to certain things that that may start failing, and certain ways to deal with those
Yeah.
problems. But as we get older, slowly but surely, those homeostasis mechanisms start to stop working until we're no longer functional.
Right.
I mean, we are programmed to be who we are through our DNA. That is how we are. I don't think there's a program of managed decline, if you know what I mean. I don't think that's the case. I think we just have ways of dealing with
Right.
damage, and that's how we age.
Yeah. So that's something interesting. You just mentioned about different people aging differently. Even
Mhm.
when you look at organisms, right? Why do organisms, all of them, age at such dramatically different rates? I mean, when we compare even a worm to us to, you know,
Yeah.
what drives such dramatically different aging rates?
Well, we don't really fully understand it, but the evolutionary answer is we have as much homeostasis and mechanisms to keep ourselves going for as long as we need to, and then after that, it's kind of up to it's there's no control of it anymore. Now, one thing I need to sort of put out there is that even within a worm, which a worm lives 2 or 3 weeks, but we can have if we have 100 worms, they're genetically identical, and they're living, and we put them in the lab in a very controlled condition, so they're almost in an identical environment. The
Right.
first worm will die after 8 days of adulthood, and the last worm will die around 24 days of adulthood, so much
Really?
longer.
Wow.
Yeah, and so what we know about aging is that as aging progresses, the difference between individuals increases. And we see that it's not just in worms, you see it everywhere you look. So you see it in mice, you see it in humans. That,
Right.
that as we get older, the differences between us are more. You know,
Got
if you
it.
take a bunch of 25-year-olds, they're all pretty much the same amount of healthiness. Might have one or two might have some issues, but when you get to say 70, the difference between individuals can be quite dramatic. Well, some might not be alive anymore, others will
Right.
be really, really healthy, and others will be somewhere in between. There'll be a big spectrum, and that's not just people say, oh, okay, that's genetics, that's
No.
your environment, that's the thing.
Right.
Of course, all those things are important, but there's also underlying all of that, there's a certain stochastic luck.
Yeah. Do you believe that aging is modifiable? Because we hear that all the time. Scientists keep saying aging may be modifiable. What does that
Yeah.
practically mean? Are we talking about slowing decline, extending resilience, or delaying dysfunction? What does it actually mean when we say that it's modifiable?
Well, I mean, the claim that it's modifiable comes from experiments in model animals. Okay, so in C. elegans, you can have a mutant or other drugs, and the worms. It's not only that they live longer, but they stay healthier for longer. You can see that, it's really clear. And
Right.
although I said there's a lot of variety between 100 worms, when you have 100 worms with the same mutation, then it all shifts, so there's still a variation between individuals, but the overall average shifts. And you see that in mice as well. So, like if you treat mice with rapamycin, they all, there's a general shift in the spectrum, and most of them live longer and stay healthier for longer. So, and we have seen it in humans as well, I think. Modern humans live a lot longer than they used to. And
Right.
they seem to age better than they used to. If you look at people that are in their 60s 100 years ago weren't as healthy as people in their 60s now.
Yeah.
But obviously there's the variation on top of that, but there's definitely, so I
Right.
think it is definitely modifiable. I think
Mm.
that is, I just don't think there's any evidence that it's completely preventable. Like I don't think you can stop aging
Yeah.
completely. I mean, it'd be
Yeah.
very hard. I mean, you can stop aging completely. You put a worm in the freezer in -80, it lives for, or
Right.
I could put a worm in the freezer and then 10 years later thaw it and it will be off. It'll be fine. So in that respect, you can stop aging, but that's not really what we're talking about.
Is aging itself effectively a disease process, even if medicine still hesitates to classify it that way?
Uh, I think it. So
Okay.
if your definition of disease is, I suppose a disease is a classified range of symptoms that gives you some sort of loss of function, right? I
Right.
would say that aging, I would say, I don't really think aging is really a disease. I think it's just but it is a root cause of a lot of diseases. It is a kind of a very, obviously we know it's a very strong risk factor for a disease. There are some aspects of aging. So when you
So
get older, it's not just that you're more likely to get disease, you're also less, a lot of functions will diminish a little bit. So you won't be able to move as quickly or, think as fast and all those kind of things. But does moving slowly and thinking slowly, would you call that a disease? I don't really think so. I think, and then the problem about calling it a disease is then if
but
it's a disease, then everyone is ill, because everybody's aging, and the older they are, the more they age. Actually,
uh,
that's another
yeah,
thing about aging. As you get older, you age faster. So
just on that point, I
yeah,
think even about moving slowly, right? We end up moving
yeah,
slowly because obviously our body is not functioning at an optimum level, right? So from that perspective, it is some amount of dysfunction which is leading to whether it's a cellular level or mitochondrial level. There is a certain amount of lack of resources that are able to drive it at the same level as a 25-year-old. So,
hmm
so would that be classified as, would dysfunction be classified as the reason for aging?
so the the result of aging is someone moving slower. The reason why they're moving slower is probably working at multiple levels, like you say, it can work at a molecular cellular level, but also at the physiological level. You might not be getting as much oxygen in your blood. Your muscle fibers are
Right.
smaller. Your muscles might be smaller or less. Your connections between your neurons and your muscles are not as good.
Right.
There's multiple reasons why you're moving slower. Many people think about aging in a linear way. They think about, right, okay, aging starts from something like, say, DNA damage. And DNA damage causes, cell senescence, and cell senescence causes effect on the tissues, and that causes effect on the organs and so on. I don't see it like that at all. I mean, yes, of course, that is true in that those things do happen. But then if your kidneys are working as well, then you're more likely to have toxins in your body, which means you're more likely to have the DNA damage. So, taking that example of why a muscle's working less, it's not like there's one thing that happened that made it happen. That all these different mechanisms of homeostasis are declining, and maybe some are going to be more important than others. We don't really understand what it is, but it might be the physiological things more important, or the neuromuscular junction is more important. We don't really know. So I wouldn't like to say one thing is a cause of another. I see them all as systems which can break down,
Right.
but it's not just all about the initial molecular lesion.
Right.
That's my way of thinking about it.
So what you're saying is, look, it's a collection of events which lead to decline, essentially.
Yeah, and they're interdependent on each other, because if you're not getting enough oxygen to your tissues, then your tissues will suffer as well, or they might, in fact, respond to that lack of oxygen and respond to that and get better, but in the way it might not mean the system works as optimally as it did. So the system is trying to, all the time, is trying to maintain itself. People, even very, very old people, mostly can move a little bit, right? So that it's doing everything it can to make it work, but it's not an optimal system anymore. But I wouldn't like to say there's one like start point that tells you that is the cause of aging.
So if aging biology is increasingly becoming a credible science, and we've been talking a lot about the interconnectedness of systems, why is healthcare still overwhelmingly organized around treating diseases individually rather than understanding aging itself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of it is just because that's how the world works, right? That's how the medical world works. Everyone is divided into therapeutic areas. That's how the pharmaceutical world works, because they also divide into therapeutic areas, and they can only get things regulated for particular diseases. It's also how the charity world works, because most charities are for specific, diseases, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and so on. And yeah, I think that's just the way that people think. I think that is slowly starting to change, but it's going to be a long time. I actually gave a talk a couple of weeks ago at the Royal College of Physicians,
Mm-hmm.
which, as you know, is like kind of like the body that gives UK physicians their kind of certification to be
Right.
doctors, and it was really fascinating to be there. But the fact that they even had a session on aging was really good, I think. We also was a session on, dealing with older people, and there's a more of a realization that treating someone in their 80s generally means treating people with multiple conditions. And so you can't this you need to know about everything, and that causes problems, which didn't happen before, because there weren't so many people in their 80s around. And now, one of the physicians said, if you make it to 80 and you're on fewer than 10 medications, you're doing well.
Just for our audience to understand, what exactly is geroscience and how different is that framework from the way current healthcare systems operate today?
So, well, geroscience is working on the biology of aging and finding interventions that slow aging, and then using those. And the idea is, if you slow aging, then you keep people healthy for longer, and so you need less healthcare in those other diseases, because people just don't get those age-related diseases in particular. So that could be, dementia,
Right.
cardiovascular disease, all sorts of things,
All the chronic conditions.
all the chronic conditions. Yeah. So that's the idea. But for it to happen, it requires a lot of resource to be put into geroscience. At
Right.
the moment, there is a tiny amount of resource into geroscience. It's supported as a branch of science, but as a kind of like special interest, something that people are kind of find interesting, but don't really think of it as a strategy to keep people healthy.
But why is that? Is it because there's not enough incentive in it, or is it the industry doesn't want to do it? What's keeping us from having geroscience become mainstream?
I think from an industry point of view, you're right that there isn't a clear path to make that happen, although that's changing a little bit. But there isn't a clear path to make it happen because, as you say, you can't license a drug to slow aging. You can
Right.
only license a drug for a disease. So that's one reason why they wouldn't do that. Secondly, I think it's a general feeling that the science isn't strong enough at the moment to say, well, okay, this is what I would do. So this
Right.
is how it would clearly work. And thirdly, I think it's just like you say, it's just not the way that the world works. It's just not the way it's the clinicians don't think like that, and so on. So, and the mindset of that, and also the politicians don't really get it either. So there's a whole lot of things there. And I think But I think there is a way around it, as I said, to focus on prevention of specific diseases, and that has been done already in a way, you know, because
Right.
I mean, if you look at prevention of cardiovascular disease by controlling blood pressure, that is an established thing. People understand the mechanism. People can measure blood pressure easily, and you can
Right.
see what the levels are high, too low. And we've got drugs that modify blood pressure. And then for each individual, if someone has high blood pressure, you can try them on one of those drugs and then see if it modifies the blood pressure all right. If it doesn't, you can try another drug. So you can modify that thing. And so you can quite easily control blood pressure from someone who's got high blood pressure. And blood pressure itself is not a disease, right?
Right.
It doesn't have symptoms directly, but it's a very well understood risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And so we
Yeah.
can use that as a way to prevent cardiovascular disease. But the other thing that happened was that also prevents other diseases like dementia. There's even some suggestions that it might prevent certain forms of cancer. And, you know, so so there are and that fits with the geroscience idea. If you break your leg, if you don't treat the broken leg, you're going to have all sorts of problems, of getting about, earning, and whatever, So, but if you repair that leg through, known techniques, you then come into a point where you're okay again, and then everything else works. So,
Right.
what I think is happening, and going back to what aging is a bit like breaking a leg, but in every little part of your body in different places. And what we need to do in terms of modifying aging is repair those legs where we can, repair those metaphorical legs in
Right.
different parts of our body. And then we support the system better. And then we can do that. And when I spoke to clinicians, they mostly think that people in the aging world are all a bit crazy, and not grounded. And they may be right in some circumstances. And there is a lot of over promising and under delivering, and
Yeah.
hype, and that doesn't help. That really doesn't help.
Just going back to your overpromising of the longevity industry, has parts of the longevity industry actually damaged scientific credibility by overpromising what's currently possible? There seems to be a lot of hype.
Yeah, I think there's two things. Yes, to a certain extent, but also there's this perception that aging research is the domain of crazy billionaires in California, you know what I mean, who want to live forever, And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make people live to 300 or 1,000, and that's the real like edge of it. And it just makes the people that say those things just seem ridiculous because that's not what people's experience is. People see aging around them all the time. They know that people are not living that long,
Yeah,
even if you live to 100, you're doing really, really well, Like
absolutely.
David Attenborough turned to 100 and he's amazing, Of men born in 1976 in the UK, only 5 out of 1,000 will make it to 100, So
Wow.
if we could have more, if instead of 5 out of 1,000 make it to 100, we had, 100 out of 1,000, 1 in 10, that would be in a huge advance,
Right.
So I think we need to like dial the expectations back a little bit. My grandmother died aged 96, but she was living independently and pretty healthily up to the age of 94. And
Wow.
that's kind of what, if everyone could do that, that would be amazing, right? I also don't want to promise that either because we haven't got to that point, but that seems a better, more realistic and more useful goal than trying to find someone that lives for 150 or something.
One of the strongest ideas emerging from this field is that health span may matter far more than lifespan because living longer means very little if function declines.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Function could decline, but you don't want to be in a state of ill health, of badly ill health. And you do see that. And also the other thing is you see from the statistics for areas of greatest social in the UK, for example, you find that not only do people live shorter, but they spend more years in ill health. So they might live to around 70, but they're spending 20 years in ill health. Whereas in the
Right.
other end of the spectrum, they might be living into the 80s, but only 10 to 15 years of ill health.
Yeah.
So definitely, yeah. I mean, no one wants to spend 20 years with dementia or something like that, So
Right.
I agreed. The Healthspan thing is really important, and that's the thing about my grandmother. She was pretty healthy. Obviously she wasn't going to be running any marathons at 94, but she was healthy. She could get around, she could live on her own, and so on. That which is what everybody would like, right?
Yeah. Just being independent is a great thing, I think. How would you define health span?
Well, I think Healthspan is just being functional. Independent is part of that, but just being functional. So that you're able to do a job, for example, to get around, to do exercise, to enjoy time with your family and friends, to
Right.
to just to be happy, I suppose, as well, right?
Yeah.
To have a laugh. So all those sort of things I think are a part of healthspan. But I do agree as well that the definition, lifespan is very easy definition. Either you're dead or you're alive. There's no like it's binary, right?
Right.
Whereas healthy or not healthy, there's always going to be some gray areas.
Yeah. Because there can be somebody who's disease free and still be biologically and functionally declining underneath, right? Because increasingly people seem
Yeah.
to be normalizing fatigue, poor sleep, low energy, metabolic dysfunction, etc.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
almost like as though decline is expected.
Some people are, like you say, normalizing what other people might think of as ill health. So it's
Right.
a difficult one. But I don't, I think there's always going to be some sort of decline, right? It's not really possible to stay as you are, like in your 20s, all the way until you're 90 and then suddenly die, right? That's not going to happen. There's going to be a decline.
What do you think is successful aging? What does successful aging genuinely look like from a scientific perspective?
So what, from an evolutionary perspective, successful aging has been around long enough to have children and, you know, see them. Maybe in humans, it's important to be long enough to have children and see them grow up. So for me, I think that is important. But then, of course, successful aging also is maintaining health, as we said before, which and maintaining ability to do the basic things that you need to do for life. So I think that's from a scientific point of view. But from a personal point of view, it's a different thing, right? From a personal point of view, obviously, everyone wants to be happy and live long enough to see their grandchildren grow up and all that kind of thing, and that, or at least hang out with their grandchildren, have fun, all those kind of things. Do things that are entertaining. That's successful from
Right.
a personal point of view.
Right. And is one of the biggest problems today, is it that decline often begins decades before diagnosis finally appears?
Yeah, I think this comes back to why I think the prevention of disease is so important, right? Because I think you know, intervening in aging in the sort of gericides way of thinking about it is not about curing a disease. I don't think aging research is going to help us cure people with Alzheimer's. I think once someone's got Alzheimer's, it's a different kind of thing. Now, I like to use the analogy of cancer, right? In cancer, because it has these clear stages, stage one, two, three, four. When you are in stage one of cancer, it can be treated, but the main thing you want to do is prevent it progressing. So there's a lot of prevention involved. Whereas if you get to stage four cancer, there's no prevention, you're just trying to treat it. I think one of the reasons why drugs towards Alzheimer's have been so unsuccessful is that by the time you diagnose with Alzheimer's, it's too late. You've developed the disease to a point where you can't prevent it. You can only try and treat the symptoms. So that means that we have to, like you say, something like dementia is happening much earlier than when we see the symptoms. How far earlier, I don't think is completely clear. But and the same thing with cancers as well. You starting to get clones and things that are happening before you actually get a cancer. So I think for all diseases, there's a point before you actually know you've got the disease where you can prevent it. How far back that is unsure. But I would say, going from an evolutionary point of view and all this, my experience is that I would say that the point when we look at worms, the point that really things start to decline with worms is day three of adulthood. They're that old, right? At day
Right.
three of adulthood, but that's also the time when generally stop reproducing, or reproducing becomes less effective. So I think when we come to the towards the end of our reproductive age, and I don't mean the reproductive ability, but most normal type of reproduction. So I would say up to about age 35 to 40, that is the time where I think that that aging is starting to accelerate faster. And
Right.
that is probably the time where we might need to intervene to prevent later things happening.
So, why is aging considered the single biggest risk factor for chronic disease?
It's simply considered the risk factor for those diseases because it's just a simple question of the older you are, the more likely you are to get it. It's as simple as that. We don't really understand what the link is between aging and the disease. Just that as you get older, your chances of getting disease go up. And if you look at all the other risk factors like, smoking or obesity or alcohol, none of them are as strong as age.
Right.
So that's all it means, really.
So, would you say that conditions like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and even neurodegeneration, do they all share common aging mechanisms underneath?
I I think they all are more likely with age, and they're more likely due to this age-dependent decline in the homeostasis mechanisms that I was talking about. It
Right.
might be like some people will get very old and have cardiovascular disease, for example, but never get dementia. And other people might be fine otherwise but still get dementia. Different people age in different ways. And that's another thing, going back to the worms. I talk about my 100 worms are genetically identical. It's not only that they die at different times, but they die in different ways. They're not
Oh,
all dying the same way. Like it's hard to say exactly why they're dying, but you can look at them and they look different, the way that they're dying.
were these worms under the same environment or were they in different environments?
Same environment, all together in the same environment.
Really? Wow.
Hmm.
Huh, that's interesting.
Just on the same little petri dish. Yeah. No,
Oh,
all I was going to say was, that variation in how aging manifests itself, I suppose, means that fits with the idea that some people will get some diseases and some people will get other diseases. And that could be partly luck, partly genetics, partly lifestyle, all those kind of things. So then that's where you get this problem about thinking about the underlying aging. Is underlying aging causing those diseases? Maybe not. It might just be that in certain people, you get more stiffening of the arteries, as you get older. Whereas other people more likely to lose control of their blood sugar. These are all homeostasis mechanisms. Some are more vulnerable to others in the same way that a certain make of car, for example, some cars, the clutch always goes early, and other cars, the engine goes, or the brakes. I don't know, the brakes isn't a great example, but what I mean. So like, there's different parts of the car that seem to go first. It could be that. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's all the same underlying aging. It just could be that the vulnerabilities are slightly different in different people.
do you see a future where medicine shifts from treating diseases individually towards targeting biological decline itself?
Yeah, I do think it will happen, but it's going to be a slow process. But I think it is. I think it's just. I think, for example, if we talk about the GLP-1 agonists, right, which has made a massive impact on the pharmaceutical industry, massive. It's been really great for people losing weight, but those were drugs that were designed to treat diabetes. And then they turned out to be really good at treating obesity. And then people were taking them for obesity, and then they found that had benefits for cardiovascular disease and all sorts of other things. So I think I think a lot of pharmaceutical companies have paid attention to that and thinking, well, okay, just because one thing is designed in one therapeutic area doesn't mean it can't work in another therapeutic area and have multiple effects. So I think that that's a big event for aging research because it shows that's the possible thing. The other way of looking at this is prevention of disease for things like people not smoking or not drinking too much or not eating too much. Now these things are become more and more apparent and understandable. And I don't know what's happening in India, but in the UK, less people smoke now, and the
Mhm.
younger people are drinking less. So things are happening, and people are staying healthier for longer. And in a way, that is exactly what you're saying. That is treating the underlying problems.
Absolutely. So we all know that aging doesn't happen in one organ or one system, right? But why is it that systems biology is still not central to understanding aging?
Because system biology is hard. And we don't know enough about biology. People have always talked about kind of making mathematical models of biology, right?
Right.
And it would be amazing. We know all the we but making those mathematical models is really hard. So because we just don't know enough biology over the last 10 or so years, being much more interested in bacteria because our research shows about bacteria affecting aging. But when you look at E. coli, which is probably the most studied organism on the planet, right? Been studied
Right.
for well over 100 years. It has roughly 4,000 genes, and but what but over a third of them we have no idea what they do. Absolutely no idea what they do. So we don't know how E. coli. We can't really make a mathematical model of E. coli because we don't even know what all the genes do. So how are we going to make a mathematical model of a human? I mean, we can do it, right? We can have a model where we say we can model simple physiological systems. We can make it, but then the physiological systems interact with the cellular and molecular systems. And it's just really, really complicated. And yes, I'm all in favor. I mean, we're about to start a project this summer trying to do some mathematical modeling of folate synthesis in bacteria. So I do think it's very powerful,
Right.
that kind of approach. But you look at humans have 20,000 genes, and we don't know what loads and loads of them do. The gut microbes, if you count all the different genes within the all the different genes in all the gut microbes, it's about 10 million different genes.
Yeah.
So we've got no idea what they're doing. If you ever do any sort of metabolomic work and you see all the things that come out of a healthy mass spec,
Yeah.
there's so many molecules there that we have no idea what they even are, never mind what they do. It's complicated, and we have to keep working towards it. We just don't know enough biology, and I think that's another reason why aging biology has not as progressed as fast as people might have thought it has, because aging biology is the decline of this system, but we don't even know how the system works when it's working optimally. So how are we going to understand what happens when it declines? So you have a system, you have a perfect system, like say you have a brand new car and you know how it works. It's been designed by somebody. We know how it works. Everything works. Okay. And so you can make predictions about what would happen when you put your foot on the gas. You know what's going to go. You know what's going to happen, right? But then you take 100 of those cars and you let them age, for a better word. Do their stuff for 10 years. Each one of those different cars is going to be slightly different from each other,
Yeah.
much more different than they were when they were brand new. When they were brand new, they're all pretty much the same. When they get older, they're all slightly different from each other. And you have to try and work out what the differences are. Now, a mechanic can go in and say, okay, yeah, that one, the engine's not working, or that one, the brake's not working, and so on. So they can pinpoint certain things. But if you've ever had an old car, it isn't as simple as that. Old cars all sorts of things start happening, and it'll
Yeah.
be different for each one. So I think that's just that's the easy version. A car is easy. You know how it's put together. A human being is much, much more complicated. So I
True.
don't want to be depressing about it. I think we still made a huge amount of progress, and we still understand a huge amount of biology. But there's so much more to do. That's why I think everyone
Yeah.
should study biology. There's enough space for everyone to study biology.
I keep telling people the same thing. I said, there's so little we know about biology. It's like we're still scratching the surface, you know. So it's great you mentioned microbe, right? Where does the microbiome fit into this larger picture?
Well, we don't really know how microbiome works in aging, but I kind of see it as it's another system with homeostasis, and it affects us. We know that the way that our gut microbes affect us, how we live. Coming back to the evolution side of things, right? When animals evolved, they didn't just evolve into a empty world. They evolved into a world full of microbes, right? The first animal had to deal from the very first animal had to deal with all these microbes around it trying to eat it.
Right.
So we've had to have the microbe animal interaction forever, right? So it's a very strong part of our biology, microbes, how we interact with microbes. With the microbiome, it's we know mammals have evolved this amazing way to carry around a whole bunch of microbes to help us. But at the same time, those microbes have got the potential to kill us as well. So we have to maintain them in this form of homeostasis where we maintain this big bag of potential killers within our gastrointestinal system in a way that keeps it under control. And you'd imagine as we age, that system of maintaining that breaks down and the balances with it break down. So that's one answer to your question. The other answer to your question is that we know from ours and other works in C. elegans, but also people have done work in mice as well, that the bacteria around the animal affect how it ages. And I just got into this because I accidentally came across a mutant of the E. coli that we used to grow this C. elegans. We used E. coli to feed the C. elegans. I found a mutant that just made the worms live a lot longer. And then I investigated why that bacteria made the worms live longer.
Right.
And not just longer, they stayed healthy for longer as well. So to cut a long story short, we found that in that bacteria, it had less synthesis of folates. And when we use a drug to inhibit folate synthesis or other mutants that could inhibit folate synthesis, the worms live longer.
Do you think
And
that's possible for humans as well?
I think it is because, the bacteria that we grow our worms on bacteria that originally came from humans. And we've done some work where we used the bacteria that was freshly isolated from humans implicated in obesity, and
Wow.
we saw the same thing. So what's good about it in a way is that the translation is kind of easier because we can work with microbes that come from humans and the same microbes. So I think so I think what's happening is there's certain microbes that make a lot of folate, and those microbes can the potential for being pathogenic or maybe just mildly pathogenic, just mildly negative towards us. And if we prevent them from making folate, we can make them less pathogenic and we will be healthier and age better.
Yeah, because most people still think of microbes as passive passengers rather than, them being active participants in biology.
Well, they're wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, some microbes are passive, and also depends on the context. It depends on the context of what they are. And, a lot of our microbes are beneficial for us. That's why we keep them there, right? We keep microbes because they produce things that are beneficial for us. But there's also microbes in there, and but in a different circumstance, those microbes could be negative for us. So it depends on the context and what they're doing and what's going on.
Right. You mentioned C. elegans before.
Yeah.
What role did organisms like C. elegans play in transforming aging science?
Well, I think the important thing about C. elegans is, well, it is easy to do aging experiments quickly. And we found single mutants of C. elegans that lived much longer. And they were the first mutants to be found in any organism that had an effect on aging, and they were down to a single gene. So I think that did transform the field. That happened in the 90s. The funny thing was, I was studying a gene, an enzyme in Drosophila when I was doing my PhD in the 90s. And it was this PI3 kinase, which was originally identified to be important in cancer. And we were trying to understand what it was doing in flies. And we found it's to do with affected the size of the flies and the size of the organs of the flies and that kind of thing. But at the same time, I was doing my PhD. That mutant in C. elegans, age one, that made worms live a lot longer, turns
Mhm.
out to be the exact same enzyme that I was working on, the PI3 kinase. So that's what got me into aging because I was inadvertently working on the same pathway that was important in aging.
Are we still underestimating the microbiome's influence on human health and aging?
Yeah, I think so. I think many people don't really think about the microbiome in terms of health and aging. I think it is important, but I think it's hard sometimes to work out the cause and effect,
Yeah.
because you know your diet and your body affect the microbiome, and the microbiome, of course, affects your health. And so there's kind of cycles.
Right.
So it's accessible in some ways, but we still don't really know how it affects human aging, and so we need to find that out.
Now, coming to decline, if decline begins quietly, like you were mentioning, long before disease appears, then would you say that prevention itself should begin much earlier than most people realize?
Uh, it's never too late to also start thinking about prevention. I think I don't want to say that, everyone should start preventing, keeping themselves healthy at a very early age, because actually when you're an older age, I know plenty of examples of people that have had, had a bad lifestyle and changed to a better lifestyle, and they seem to have improved, so
Right.
even at a very relatively late age. I don't think it's too late to start prevention. But yeah, of course. I mean, the earlier you start, the better.
It's never too late.
But it's never too late. No, I think that's important.
So do you
You know.
do you think that's why our healthcare systems intervene so late?
So
Right.
I was talking with a stroke doctor. Okay, and what they do is that if someone has a stroke, they check their carotid artery in the neck to see if there's atherosclerosis.
Yeah.
There's plaques there, right? And if there's plaques there, they can open up the artery and take out the plaque and make you less likely to have another stroke. So I said my obvious question was, shouldn't people be checking this before they have a stroke, not after they have a stroke, right?
Right.
Surely you should want to know. But the healthcare system cannot cope with that because it doesn't have the resources to scan everyone's neck. And then if it's blocked up,
Clean it up.
but
Yeah.
then you, but then you think, right? The problem about it is actually it's to do with the way that we think about it's the financial model of these things, right? Because if you could do something preventative early and stop someone having a bad disease like a stroke or something, then the overall cost of that treatment is much less, right? But you have to do it across many more people. So in some respects, per person it's less, but for a population it might be quite a lot of money.
Right.
But overall, I still believe it will be less money to do it
Yeah.
that way, right? But the
Yeah.
problem is the money that we save by not having someone have a disease, that money doesn't come back to the person who's doing the prevention in the first place. So that's the system we need to have. So,
Yeah.
for example, we're talking about the winter in England, right? In the winter in England, the roads get icy, right? But but the local authorities, they put salt on the roads to stop people having car accidents, but they
Right.
don't generally put salt on the pavements where people are walking, right? But if we put salt on the pavements of people walking, then much less likely that someone's going to have a fall. And if you have a fall, if you're elderly, it's basically really bad for you, and you could have high mortality and so on, right? So surely the cost of putting salt on the pavements is tiny compared to the cost of treating people that have falls. Also, if you put someone on the pavement, people are more likely to be able to walk, have more exercise, go and do things. But the problem is the people that put the salt on the pavements don't get the money that's saved from not having the surgery. But
Mm.
we need to make sure that's the fun. That's kind of like epitomizes the problem that you came at from the first place, is that the money doesn't go to the right people for the right things.
That's so interesting because when you really look at it, I think one of the problems is they equate money saved, like you were mentioning, at a population level. Preventive care can be huge, but then they forget the fact that when somebody has a condition and suffers a stroke, right, the productivity that the individual loses over a period of time and what he or she can contribute to the society is far, far greater than, any of the insurance amounts that would pertain to an individual treatment per se.
Yeah. I mean, the savings of society, I mean, and we have to do it like you were talking about an aging society that we have. The aging society is only going to get worse.
Yeah.
And we have to do this. We have to do the prevention, but it requires investment. It requires long-term thinking
Right.
because you're putting an intervention that only pays off 10, 20 years later. And that doesn't work in terms of politics. People
Yeah.
are only in power for 4 years, so they're not going to see the payback if they spend this money on the prevention.
But I think as a society, if we all start demanding for it,
Yeah.
when it comes from people, it should change. But coming back to when people hear longevity science today, there's often a lot of confusion between what's real and what's hype. What do you have to say
Absolutely.
about it?
I think that the problem is that well, there's two problems. I think one, on the scientist level, people find that they need to overhype their stuff to get funding and attention. But also, I think we've also got an issue of the way of social media and influencers and sound bites. When you go
Yeah.
and look on anything, you'll have a sound bite. Someone just does a short video and they say, okay, this is the thing you need to do to slow your aging, and this
The
is
one
what you
miracle.
have to take, and this is the one miracle thing you all have to do, whatever it is, right? And that people like that stuff, and so people click on it and they get lots of clicks, and these people make money out of saying this stuff. But if you came on and you did like what we're doing now, for like talking for like an hour and a half about
Right.
the nuances and stuff, you're not going to get, I mean, hopefully you'll get a decent audience, but you're not going to get millions of views,
Go on.
and
Go on.
people listening to all of that.
Yeah. So, what interventions today genuinely have strong scientific credibility?
Not smoking, not drinking, doing regular exercise, definitely. Eating a
Right.
balanced diet. Yeah, not overeating. Obesity is a major, I mean, in fact, I mean, when I was talking to those clinicians, the main things they were talking about was obesity, you know, smoking and alcohol. Those are the main things. Beyond that, it kind of depends, it depends on your circumstances, So, for example, if you live where I live in the north of England, you should definitely be taking vitamin D, because we do not get enough sunlight here.
Yeah.
And it's been shown to have effect on inflammation. But when they did a major trial, it didn't really seem to affect aging. A European trial didn't really seem to affect aging. There was a little bit of an effect when they did that on omega 3s. It seemed to have an effect on the infection, but not on some other things.
Oh, how promising is the future of longevity therapeutics and drug discovery?
Well, I think it needs a major effort. Like drug discovery, I mean, I've been involved in drug discovery through my company, and drug discovery is a long and difficult process that takes a lot of money and resource. And so you need that. And I think I mean, there's companies spending a lot of money on that. To get a drug for a normal disease, and a disease takes a lot of resource. It takes a decade, takes, $5 billion,
Yeah.
$5 to $10 billion. That's just for a disease. Whereas I think for longevity or aging, it's going to be
Yeah.
much more, because it takes more time, more. So I think you need huge amounts of resource for it to happen, but it is definitely changing.
I'm hoping even the amount of drugs that we have, if some of those could be repurposed and do work for aging. What excites you most about the next decade for aging science?
Can I say something about the repurposing thing
Sure.
there, if I don't, if I may?
Yeah.
The problem with the repurposing is that it's difficult in terms of the intellectual property and the patent life. And actually,
Right.
patent life is a major obstacle for drug discovery,
Uh-huh.
because I think it's 20 years, an extra 5 years you can get, but it's just not enough time, and I think we need to change that. But yeah, so that's the problem. There's lots of repurposed drugs out there that actually could have a great effect on aging. The bisphosphonates, for example, are a great example, as well as the rapamycin, maybe metformin. But we just don't have the funds to do those trials because no one's going to make any money out of them. So that's the problem.
Right. So, looking further ahead, do you think aspects of biological aging may eventually become, if not entirely, at least partially manageable?
Maybe, yeah.
Right.
I think it's definitely possible, but I don't think we're going to stop aging. I just
Okay.
think we're going to be able to slow aging and keep people healthy for longer. But I think absolutely stop, like we were talking about earlier, is unlikely to happen, at least for the next 50 years.
Right.
Maybe after that they would. But I do think and we've already, as we said earlier, we're already aging further. And I think what's nice about thinking about aging as a system that you can work, it means that you don't have to look for the one silver bullet. You can work on it from lots of different aspects. So you can
Right.
support different parts of your body in different ways, and there's multiple things you can do to slow your aging, and that's already happening. And
Right.
so yeah, I think there's lots of potential there. Absolutely.
So we have a little tradition here in Brighter 100 where we ask our guests, it's called their quick fire round. These are just rapid questions. You can just give simple answers. And if they're complex answers, that's fine too. So are you ready? What's the one thing most people fundamentally misunderstand about aging?
They misunderstand that as we age, the difference between individuals increases. And so we all age differently for probably purely luck reasons. I don't think people get that.
Right. We spoke about hyping. What's the one longevity trend you think is overhyped?
Uh, I think that there's a general kind of marketing concept of cellular health. I think that's too vague and doesn't really make sense. And I think it comes back to this idea of this linear progression and like the hallmarks of aging being like fundamental. I'm not a big fan of the hallmarks of aging. I think that whole model is not the way to go. Even though individual hallmarks of aging are obviously important things to study in aging. I think that the general idea that, you can just fix this thing on the cellular level is the only way to go. I think it does annoy me.
One area of aging science you think deserves far more attention than what it gets?
Wow, I would say the gut microbiome, but I think what else? I think just general things of understanding physiology, and how that affects that's important. I think that hasn't, do you know what I mean? The whole system.
Right.
I think that's not really gets enough attention. But there's loads of areas. I think aging involves everything. So there's loads of areas that probably haven't even thought about in terms of aging that don't get enough attention.
If you could place one message about Healthspan on a billboard for the world to see, what would it say?
Funding research on Healthspan is just as valuable as funding cancer research.
Right. And what are you most optimistic about the future?
I think I'm optimistic about like I said before, getting the public involved in understanding aging research and making a difference in understanding the importance of preventive disease. I think there's a lot to be done there.
Right. David, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a fascinating conversation that challenged how we think about aging, health, and also the future of medicine. I also want to thank you and acknowledge what you're doing for aging and all the wonderful work at the British Society for Research on Aging. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
We explored the science of aging, health span, the role of microbiome and metabolism, and why aging itself may become one of medicine's most important frontiers. Thank you again for joining us on Brighter 100. Until next time, stay healthy, stay curious, and take better control of your health. This is Brighter 100 from Longeny.